Hello and welcome back to another episode of Vintage Pens for the Modern User. I'm glad you've joined me here, and I hope your enthusiasm for using vintage pens on a daily basis increases every time you view one of my videos. Today we are going to look at a pen made from outside of the USA. Thus far all my videos have explored makers here in the United States. But today we're going to journey to Germany. Those of you who maybe are familiar with only modern makers of pens are probably familiar with M&YPens, Pelikan, and Quebeco. All three companies have been in existence for quite a long time, and today we're going to hone in specifically on Pelikan pens and their vintage pens, and why I think you should consider delving in to this wonderful manufacturer and exploring the variety of options that they provide as a regular daily writing instrument. So let's take a close look. Pelikan fountain pens. What a beautiful tray and display of some of the variety of options that we're going to look at today. They are well-made vintage pens. They are all piston fillers that I have presented for you. And so if you are familiar with any pens that use a piston filling mechanism, or even if you are simply familiar with using an ink converter, which is a piston filler, I think you will find these pens easy to use every day and a delight. Let's look closer at some of the examples I have presented here. Here in front of me is the first fountain pen that Pelikan developed. This model is known as the Pelikan 100, and it was developed in 1929. Now, prior to that, Pelikan was in business, and they had been making primarily inks and art supplies for nearly 100 years before they started making fountain pens. You can identify the early Pelikan 100s because they have a very flat end on their piston filling knob, and the piston filling knob also sometimes has an arrow, and it has sort of a knurled gripping portion. When you uncap these pens, they do post very nicely and firmly and allow you to have a quite comfortable grip in the hand, although they remain short, therefore easy to place in the pocket when not in use. Demonstration of the piston is difficult to do. Some of these early pens you cannot see very well through. These earliest models did use a cork seal, and so you should look for one that has been restored if you seek one out. You should know that the nibs on the early models can be quite flexible and quite delightful. We'll take a look in a bit at the nibs that Pelikan made, and that's one of the reasons I think it's a good pen to explore. You may not find many color options, but you can find delightful nibs. Next in Pelikan's lineage was the model 100N. At the 100Ns, you had more tapering of the piston knob, and even the cap was tapered a bit more. And during the series of 100N, you began to find Pelikan pens being made that use synthetic seals, so you no longer had corks. These are the same synthetic seals in theory that Pelikan uses today, and so they're very reliable and very easy to use. You can see here, if I get a little bit closer, perhaps how the piston, of course, extends downward and then back in order to fill with quite a large volume of ink. These pens can be used for an extended period of time over many days and weeks and months of writing, depending on how much you write with them. And the ink will last you a long time because of the whole barrel being filled. Next in Pelikan's manufacturing, I may have not stated, but the Pelikan 100N was introduced in 1937. In 1950, Pelikan revised their historic pens and came out with the Model 400. The Model 400 was, as you can see, quite a change in design, the pens being slightly thinner and about the same length, although just a skosh longer. You can still see slight rounding, but by all intents and purposes, a pretty squared off end of the pen. Same piston mechanism. Once they had a good thing going, they didn't change it. So these are also piston filling with silicone piston seals, or synthetic piston seals, I should say. And these pens, as you can see, perhaps did have the stripes, but you could see through them. So you could always see your volume of ink when you were using a Pelikan pen, and know if you needed to fill the pen before you all of a sudden ran dry. So there we have Pelikan 100, 100N, and 400. The company then made a transition between the 400 using something called the 400N, which is less commonly found, and made their way into something known as the 400NN. These pens here were much more streamlined in shape and design. The piston end is now streamlined off, and the cap is tapered more up at the top. About the same size still. Again, post very nicely still and hold a large volume of ink. We'll write with one of these pens in short order. In the 1950s as well, Pelikan came out with something known as the 140. This replaced a Pelikan pen that was in manufacture prior to this, known as the IBIS pen. They were geared towards a slightly less expensive price point. They are slightly smaller. You will notice most of the pens I have in front of me have a green stripe variation. It's the most common color that you will find, but you can find tortoise, you can find black, you can find some with overlays, caps, or full body overlays. Not in the 140 series. These you can actually find in a variety of solid colors as well as the striped color, but those are more difficult to find and more expensive to procure. But if you want a delightful writing experience, just seek out one of these basic green stripe pens. You can do so at a good price. These pens, all that I've shown so far, had 14 karat gold nibs in them. And again, we'll take a look at the nib chart that Pelikan made to see all the writing options that you could have. During the 1950s as well, in about 1955, Pelikan came out with a school pen, a piston filling pen known as the 120. You can see it is very similarly sized and shaped to the 140. These were just in this solid color and very limited selection of what you could buy. They did not have gold nibs. They had steel nibs, some of them being plated with a gold plating. You can still find delightful nibs even in the school series. This one is marked Steno, which actually means it would have a little bit of flexibility. A quick note as I do when I show a pen that has a sticker on it, these can be more desirable for collectors because of what the sticker preserves. They can be used, but care should be taken to really preserve the quality of the pen and to ensure the sticker is not damaged or removed. And finally, Pelikan came out with something in 1958 known as the Pelikan P1. This was a piston filler, and the company was transitioning to a new model, a more streamlined, sleek design at the end of the 50s, going into the 60s and beyond. These pens sort of compete to some extent with the Parker 51 that became so prominent worldwide. You can see a hooded nib here at the end. And the ink view is down here, known as portholes, still piston filling. These had a rather large section and write very reliable. In fact, this pen I keep almost always inked and in my desk drawer and use it on a regular basis. So since that's the first pen that already has ink in it, I'll give you a little taste at what it looks like to write with. Give myself a fresh sheet of paper here. This pen has an oblique double broad nib in it. It's difficult to see because of the hooded section, of course, but it does have that chiseled slight and it's slightly oblique offset. I am an overwriter, but there's no reason to not use a fountain pen even as an overwriting left-handed person, because the pen will do the work for you if you use it properly. So Pelikan P1, from 1958 they were made until about 1962. It was a short run. You could find them in a variety of colors, primarily black, green, burgundy, and gray. You could find them with stainless steel caps or with rolled gold caps. They write quite lovely. You can see to some extent the line variation that I can get from this oblique broad nib that I have here. So the Pelikan P1, since this one's already inked, I'm not showing you how to ink the pen, but let's take another look at the Pelikan 400 that I showed you earlier. and just really give you a good demonstration, because Vintage Pens for the Modern User is all about showing how convenient and easy it is to use these pens. Now, I typically use inks that have a tried and true history. This here is, of course, Pelikan's 4001 series, the blue. It's a wonderful ink. As I stated earlier, Pelikan made inks before they made pens. So you can be very confident, rest very assured that you can use these inks in these vintage pens with no problem. So while I was talking, I did extend the piston down. So by turning the piston in a clockwise motion, you extend the piston forward. Depending on how much ink you have, you may have to tilt your ink bottle, place the nib in, and of course rotate it clockwise back. Apparently it was counterclockwise, but it all depends on how the pen has been oriented in terms of what direction you go. The challenge with some of these is if you don't have a good full bottle of ink, or if you don't have it oriented correctly, you may not have dunked the pen sufficiently in. So I'm going to give it a second shot here and see if I can suck up some of that good Pelikan blue ink. This is a really beautiful ink. And then of course, well, I always say close the ink well because you don't want to spill on your hand. And then here we have the Pelikan 400. This pen has some flexibility. It's a medium nib. This pen was began production in 1950. There is, some flexibility here. So depending on how I write, I can write lightly, I can press in a little bit, and I can get some nice line variation. So here you see the Pelikan 400 from 1950, a little bit of a writing sample, a little bit of a demonstration. One of the reasons I advocate vintage pens is because they were made to be used every day. That's what the manufacturers intended, and they are very durable. Take a look here at this nib chart, and you can see how many options for nibs you have, which is another reason I suggest people take a look at these vintage pens, because if you're into expressive writing, the world is your oyster when you look at what Pelikan provided in terms of the nibs that you could use to really express yourself. They have quite an array, and many people are aware that Pelikan made nibs that were threaded into their sections. And so usually if you're going to change a nib, you want to turn it downward, cradling the nib here in the index finger, and then holding tightly and turning. If it doesn't want to turn, as this one does not, it may become stiff because of some dried ink or not having been turned. Don't force it, simply soak it for a little bit, and you'll find that they thread out very easily. There's no need to put any silicone grease on any of these threads or anything like that. Some people with maintenance will try to get a little dab of silicone up in the piston once they've removed this, but it does make it easy to clean the pen. You can, of course, submerge this in water, and you can flush the barrel there nicely, using a syringe to flush water through it, or whatever method of cleaning you like. So you don't have to work the piston back and forth with the nib in it if you desire, and you turn it back in. Again, I grip the nibs here and I turn the pen. That's a very safe way to do it, and you don't force anything. Once it's tight, it's tight. There's no reason to go beyond. So here we have Pelikan vintage fountain pens, an array of pens made in an array of colors, as you saw from my initial shot there with tortoise, gold pens, etc. They're excellent writers. They're very usable for people who want to use pens every day, and I really do advocate people give these nice vintage pens a close look. Thanks for joining me. Happy writing.